Okay, so in this lesson, we're going to look at creating a few objects and looking at how to manipulate them. So, if we go to the Create window right here, or menu, we have a whole bunch of different objects that we're capable of creating. You can experiment with them if you'd like. But for right now, I am going to focus on creating polygon primitives because for the most part, this is where you're going to be focusing your efforts. You can also access many of these objects here, although more of them are available here in this menu. Also notice on the bottom down here, I've turned off interactive creation, and I'll show you why right now. So if I click on sphere with it turned off, I get a sphere with it in the center of the scene with known attributes. And if we look at the channel box, everything is set to 0, 1. Oops. I did that accidentally. We'll discuss that in a minute, but so if we had interactive creation turned on, and actually let me show you this because this is pretty cool that you can do here. There's this bar on the top that if you click on it, it'll make it a floating window. If you need to access a specific set of tools a lot, you can do that. It makes it a little bit quicker to work with. So if I turn interactive creation on and I created sphere, I can drag and it creates a sphere. You can see that there are attributes set to it already, which makes it a little bit difficult to work with, although we can reset that. Although we have a size over here of the sphere, which I'm not sure of exactly unless I go into my sub-object area, which gives me the specifics for the sphere. I know that it has a radius of 4.2, which is a bit of a off number. So if we look and we move, like we discussed last lesson, I'm just pushing W. You can click on the tool here, but I select the W, and then I can move this. And I'm just grabbing the arrow and pulling it right now. We'll discuss more about the gizmo in a minute. But if I were to just, let me turn off interactive creation. And when I create this, you can see that it has a radius of 1, which means that if I were to scale this 10, I know that is a 10-unit object. If I go here, and this has a radius of 4.2, and let's say I scaled it to something like 9, I'm not exactly sure how many units across this is. I mean, we can measure it and try to figure it out, but that's really why I like to use the interactive creation turned off. It gets a little bit more tricky with things like cubes, for example. So if I were to draw this out, this is obviously some sort of box, but it's not a cube where each one of the measurements is exactly equal. And we can also look at the settings here where it shows that the height, width, and depth are not the same. And again, if we were to scale, we don't know what the units are exactly. We can calculate it out, but we don't know it exactly, and it's not created in the center. I like things to be predictable. So I like starting off with kind of a predictable object, and then we can modify it from there. We looked a little bit at creating, let me turn that off. Okay, modifying settings here in the channel box. So once you've created it, you can actually change the default settings for any one of these objects. So we have radius, We can type in a number there and change the radius. We have subdivision axis, which if we were to bring that to 3, you can see that the subdivisions around the axis are now at 3. We can bring it up to something like 8. Subdivision height will be similar, but it's going up and down, so we can actually change how many subdivisions there are going up and down the object here. And let's not worry about that last one right now. I'm going to select this and push delete to get rid of it. Also, we can go to what's called an option box on the right-hand side here of the object. So when you click that, we get a whole bunch of default settings that we can use to create our object. So we can set what the divisions are, just like we had there, depth divisions, width divisions. This is cubes, so yeah. We have X, Y, and Z divisions, our height, width, and depth, and then we can decide which axis we're creating on it. If we want to create UVs, do we want to normalize them, and a whole bunch of other settings. We can set these as defaults, or we can reset them to our default settings. So yeah, that is how you can manipulate all of those settings. I'm going to create a default cube so that we can look at it. With it selected, something really cool that we can do is if we push F on the keyboard, it's going to focus on that object or frame it within our window. If I push spacebar, you can see that it hasn't done that on all the windows, but if I hover over it, you can actually push F and it will focus in on it. So that is a good way to be able to select an object and be able to get it clearly in the screen really quickly. If we were to zoom in on this, and let's say we were too close to it and we selected it, but we wanted to see the whole object, we can also push F as well. Also, if we were like too close to it, and let's say we were like lost and we didn't know where we were at, if we push F without anything selected, it will frame everything in the whole scene. So let's say I created a few more objects so that we can see this a little bit more clearly. So if I push this F, we're focused in on that. Push F, I'm focused in on that. And we've lost the other two objects. So if I click off of this and push F, it will focus into everything that is visible in our scene. Okay, so let's look at how we can manipulate our objects. We looked a little bit at the move tool, again pushing W on the keyboard. We can click individual arrows to move it along a individual axis. So the red one represents X, blue one represents Z, and the green one represents Y. If you look at the bottom left-hand corner right here of our viewport, you can see the angle that we're viewing in. So that gives us an idea of how we're lined up, and it also gives us the representation in X, Y, and Z, what the color represents. So we can do that. You'll see that there's these squares in between the axes. So if we click on the squares in between the Y and the X, you'll see that we can only move in the Y and the X. And you'll see that it highlights those axes when I click on that and I start moving. Same thing here, but with the Z and the Y, and then over here for the X and the Z. So if we had needed to move an object specifically on only two axes, we can do that. Here also we have a center square in the center of the gizmo, and what that is going to do is let you move the object based off of where the camera is looking at it. So if you were to create a plane that is parallel with the view of the camera, so like if we were to like take this and just have a flat plane that is moved further back to the level of where your object is based off the camera view, you're moving along that axis. So you're really moving along 3 axes, but they're based off of where the camera is at. So if I were to rotate here, I'm moving on all the axes based off of the way the camera is looking. I'm not moving in depth at all, forward or back. I'm only moving it along the view of where the camera is. Or at least I'm not moving it forward and back based off of the camera. It stays the same distance away from the camera as far as depth goes. Okay, so let's look at rotation. So with rotation, we can see that we have individual axes as well, like we did with the previous object, or the previous modification mode, which was move. So we can actually rotate the object on individual axes here. There's not a way to rotate on 2 axes, but you can rotate on 3 by just clicking in the center, and you can actually rotate in all the different axes at the same time based off of where you're rotating. I try to avoid that as much as possible because you don't know exactly how much you're rotating in any particular mode. You can see that I've already rotated over 360 degrees on the X, and maybe I just wanted a movement like this, but and actually I got pretty close to the same, and I'm getting a lot of very different values, and that's because it doesn't know how much on each specific rotation you want to get there. And it can cause issues in the future like gimbal lock and things like that if you're animating. It's not too much of a deal if you're just modeling and you need to get it in a specific position and you're never going to animate it, or you're going to reset the values before you start animating it. So you can do that, I guess. Here on the outside, we have another circle that rotates your objects based off of a flat plane on the camera. So depending on how we are looking at the object, we can rotate it on the axes based off of how the camera is looking at it. Going back to this, you can see that as we rotate, the axes are moving with it. So we're not, like with the move tool, locked into the X, Y, and Z, but we can change this both for the rotation and the move tool. It might be a little bit more obvious to look at it right here. So with the move tool, we're not specifically lined up with the cube anymore. We're lined up with the axis of the world. If we double click on the move tool, or we access the move tool that we had before through up here, we get our tool settings. In this case, we're looking at is our axis orientation, and right now it's set to world. If we were to click on this and switch it to object, for example, now you can see that our axis is lined up to the world coordinates. Although what you will notice is that if, for example, we move in the z-axis here, which is the object's z-axis, that it is actually changing several values here. It's not just moving the z, it's moving actually all 3 of the values as we move about it with it. So it could be a good way to move an object if you need to be able to constrain it to the way that the object is moving, but know that it will be different than what the world values are. So it's just kind of a different way to move it for the world, I guess. So let's go back to world on this one for now, and let's look at the rotation. So right now, by default, we were set to object. and we can change this to world, and you'll see that I can rotate the object, but it doesn't change the way my gizmo is oriented. I can go back to object mode, and it will orient to the object. And that is going to be accessible for any one of your modification modes, or your translate, rotate, and scale, or move, rotate, and scale. Okay, let's look at scale. Scale looks a lot like the move tool, where we can scale on individual axes, or we can move on two. We can, on this one, on the center one, instead of moving based or scaling based off of the camera view, what it does is scales uniformly on all three axes. So that is the scale, move, and rotate. We can actually select objects with any one of these modes. So if we're in rotate, we can select everything. We can scale it in scale, or we can scale it in move. I mean, not scale, but we can select it. So you can select objects with any of these modes on, but sometimes you might be in a way where it's kind of hard to select because of the gizmo is in the way. So you do have the option to just be in your select mode, and that will let you select all the different objects without the gizmo getting in the way. Looking at the gizmo also, if we push the plus and minus keys, we can make it bigger and smaller. So if it is in the way and you still want to access it, or have that visible without switching back and forth from the tools, if you push the plus and minus key, you can actually change the size of it. So sometimes you might be zoomed in on an object and it's just, I can't access that that gizmo on the other side, the Z that I was trying to use before. I can zoom down and access it. Sometimes I find it necessary to do that, but not too often. Usually I can get away with keeping it the size that I'm comfortable with. Sometimes people like working with really small gizmos. Sometimes they like working with bigger versions of them. Whatever your preference is, I typically, if it gets in the way, just switch over to the move tool. But if you didn't want to do that and you needed to change the size, you can. Okay, so that's our basic object manipulation. Actually, let's look at, we did talk a little bit about changing it, but I did want to say that in your channel box you can manipulate all of these objects, and also in the attribute editor, if we go to the proper tab, we can actually modify all these values as well. Typically I like doing it in the channel box, but sometimes I do find it necessary to do it in the attribute editor because maybe there's more settings that I want to modify than I can in the channel box. Oh, and another thing that you can do that is pretty cool is, let's say I wanted to rotate the value, specifically Y, I can select it, and then if I middle mouse button drag in the scene, I can actually have it change that individual channel just by middle mouse button dragging our object. So a few other ways that we can manipulate objects in here. So in the next lesson, we're going to go in and look at what sub-objects are and modifying those sub-objects as well. So I look forward to having you in our next lesson. See you there.